Thank you again for joining today's webinar, Why Projects Fail. Now I'll turn it over to Brian Turner and Greg Gardner.
Thank you for the intro. Before we get started, I have one question for you. Could you eat this? Really? Could you fit this in your mouth? And maybe a third question is, what do you think the piece of pizza would taste like after the fries and burger? Well, for most of us, when we showed up to work today, what's on our plate at work looks a lot like this. So before you think, is this guy going to talk to me about dietary trends? Let me make the connection. I have this friend, John. John is a CIO for an energy company. And about 8 months or so ago, John called me and he said, hey, we have to get to dinner. I'm having some problems. And we went to dinner, and, it's funny. John began the conversation really with, my IT team is getting the major smackdown in the organization. We have this continued record of failure. Now, John is a structured guy, so after we talked a little bit, he pulled out his spreadsheet portfolio of projects that had 143 projects on it, to which I said, you got to be kidding me. And, he said, oh, absolutely. Isn't this great? We're going to do all these things and basically solve the world. As we kind of worked through the conversation, the story became very simple and straightforward. For John and his peers in the senior leadership team, annual planning and running the portfolio was a little bit like buffet binging. You got to pick and choose what you wanted to do and how you wanted to contribute to corporate goals, and you always worked for volume over quality. Now, if you're part of John's organization, every time these guys would get together to talk about initiatives, you knew today was going to be a bad day because you're going to be increasingly put in a position where you couldn't deliver. There was simply too much going on. Let me introduce myself. I am Brian Turner. I am the practice director for Point B's Project Leadership Services practice, which is really focused on strategic execution. And I'm really passionate about today's topic. For Greg and I, we're like the Blues Brothers. We're on a mission, and that mission is simply this. We want to try to arm and equip you as leaders with all of the insights and practices that we've acquired over time on how to position your projects for success. Now, let's meet Greg.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for the introduction. I'm not quite a blues brother, but I am from Chicago. I'm Greg Gardner, and I'm a principal in our Project Leadership Services practice. And I'm pretty passionate about this subject, too, because of how many times I've been called in to turn around projects or programs that are not doing so well. While Brian and I probably each have our bag of tricks around how we fix things, we were curious several months ago around whether or not our insights were shared by others in terms of what causes failure. So we set out to survey a number of clients and non-client executives representing around 19 different industries. 86% of those were from organizations that have over 1,000 employees, and nearly all take on many dozens of projects over the previous year. And we asked them questions around what happens when projects fail, and what do you think was the root cause? First, let's look at what they thought the impacts were for failure. The most frequent ones were the ones right at the heart of most businesses: not meeting business goals, additional costs, and customer expectation misses. Pretty big deal. That caused us to turn and look at, what are those causes of all of those impacts? It's not what you'd think at first blush. It's not the typical project and program planning or even resources. What really bubbled to the top was trying to do too much and lack of organizational alignment around those business goals. We think there's more to the story, that it's like an onion. The things that you see on the outside in terms of delays, overruns, missed expectations, those have some proximal causes that are just below the surface that we find when we come in and engage with our clients around lack of resources or poor scope management or quality. But really, we think that the survey results ring true, that at the heart of all of those things, the reason why you end up in those situations is lack of alignment and trying to do too much. Brian, did our findings surprise you at all?
I don't know if they really surprised me as much as it made me think about how hard it is to get to the center of the onion, to use your metaphor. typically when we're working with a project that is off the rails, the surface level things like not having enough resources, maybe, not managing scope well, those are, relatively straightforward and seen. But then kind of once you do that peel back to your point and you get down to like, hey, not everybody's on the same page and they don't know what success looks like, that's really where the tough stuff begins. But I think a more fundamental question for all of us is why is this occurring? So what I mean by that is think about your own organization and, why the number of projects that you are taking on exceeds supply. And try to really understand, like, what's driving that in your organization. Generally, as I look across industry and across geography, there are definitely some structural things, right? There's the impact of government regulation in healthcare, energy, financial services. There's the short product life and short innovation cycle in retail and high tech. And there's even kind of the ongoing war for customers. All of that drives the need to do more.
Right.
But, at a very more subtle level, as I've spent time with an increasing number of executives, I think today executives are also off balance in the sense that they know their lifespan in an organization can be really short, and they have a very short window of time to make an impact. And I think that puts them in a position of trying to make a mark and trying to drive fast, which ultimately can create the situation where demand outstrips supply.
Certainly, Brian. I'd even add to that list the kind of the hangover from the Great Recession, right? Many of us went through that, had project budgets, et cetera, slashed to a point where, frankly, you're barely keeping the lights on, and that's led to even more of this pent-up demand and the need to keep going. I'm kind of lucky. I operate the PMO leader community in Chicago, and so I get to talk about some of these topics beforehand to kind of pick brains of folks more than the survey. And frankly, I was surprised how much those leaders echoed the same sense of plate spinning and all the different things that have to go on and the inability to kill any projects. Really, some progress in terms of fast failure models to help weed out some of the projects that don't need to happen, but really it's an environment where only the organizations with very strong internal strategic alignments are actually getting a lot of stuff done.
Greg, think about the peers that you work with, and you think about what capabilities cause certain practitioners to rise to the top in their performance. Well, in the past, I think a lot of it was their ability to predictably control projects. And I think to your point, in today's age, I think the number one differentiator between a successful program leader or PMO leader is the ability to spin multiple plates, to do that balancing act of where do I shift resources and how do I shift timing. And that's a much different capability than we've seen in the past.
Right, and of course that leads us to this inevitable scenario when you're spinning plates, is that one of those can fall down when, luckily some folks are able to build some models and some space where they have the room to cancel projects and make that work, but that isn't always the case. So, Brian, when we think about this from the context of our study, I think we've come through with some different thoughts around what does good look like? I'm curious, how you, as you've been working with senior leaders in this space for a long time, how do you define good?
It's a great question. Going back to our food analogy, I know some of you might actually be in the middle of your lunch right now, and hopefully for those of you guys on the West Coast like me, it's not causing your stomach to get hungry. But I think, if you look at this plate of food, there's several attributes that I think correlate to what does a healthy portfolio look like. There's a sense of clarity of, okay, what actually do I need to consume to really deliver the outcomes that my organization needs? There's a sense of balance on this plate of, am I taking on the right initiatives that actually cause my organization to grow and thrive? there's definitely a sense of discipline of not loading your plate up too much, to really focus in on, this is the fuel that I need to get me between this meal and the next. And notice there's no sweets on this in this picture, and that reminds us that those discretionary projects that seem so interesting and exciting that don't tie to organizational performance, they may not be that important. And I think a lot of it starts with alignment of your strategy to the outcomes you're trying to achieve, to the initiatives that you're taking on.
So obviously our discussion sort of begs the question of, how do you know if you have a problem? I mean, I think your colleague, John, has 143 projects. That's pretty clear that maybe there's something going on. But we wanted to explore kind of the diagnostic toolkits that we use as leaders and when we come in and help clients understand and rationalize their work. We want to start with some traditional portfolio tests, the things that you might call the math or science of program management or of assessing your portfolio around capacity, dependencies, and change saturation. And then we're going to give you a couple of tools that maybe you haven't thought of in this context around benefits drivers, the minimum viable product, stakeholder heat map, and customer voice. So let's start off with capacity tests. Certainly it's one of the most basic ones that probably you all do, especially if you think in the project level. It can be as simple as, hey, do I have enough Java developers or database architects in order to achieve some software project, for example. But the kind of expert move is to also look at this from the lens of leadership capacity. Do we have enough, is the senior leadership team stretched too thin trying to achieve too many different objectives? And how will that play into the ability to achieve the outcomes that you look to do? Dependency tests, again, are similar. So we think about that from a classical project management point of view. At the lowest level, making sure that task A and task B and the sequencing of those tasks and activities or sub-projects, that everything all chains out in a way that makes sense, and you don't have a predecessor that needs to happen after some subsequent task for some odd reason. Again, this helps you to ferret out or flesh out those cases where timelines don't agree or scope expectations really differ. It's great for generating some, helping you identify maybe some alignment issues just from the surface of that.
When I think of dependencies, Greg, I think increasingly those of us on this call are really focused in on the dependency between the initiatives we're trying to take on and the organization's ability to really absorb that pace of change. And when we think about looking at your portfolio from a change saturation standpoint, we begin that shift away from what does the math tell us to actually how well positioned you are to deliver on the commitments you signed up for. And, many of you on this call, now are probably looking at your portfolio of okay, across my organization, who's affected by what initiatives? How big is that impact going to be? Where is there conflict between those projects where that change doesn't line up? And ultimately, what is the impact on the outside world, our customers and our business partners? And, that is a whole new dimension of figuring out, do you have a problem? Are you well positioned to deliver this change? Now, as Greg indicated, there's several methods that Greg and I have tried over the past couple of years that we've borrowed from project management, and we've rolled it up to the portfolio level of a company with some really interesting results. And more than anything, we wanted to add these methods to your toolkit. So the first one that we're going to talk about is what we call the benefits drivers test. And it's really simple. It's really looking at two main things. Number one, are you able to deliver the expected outcomes in the time frame you committed to across a set of initiatives? Number two, are you actively balanced in the way you are moving the different levers of the business, or are you oversaturated towards one benefit over another? Let me explain what I mean by that. Imagine you're a retailer in a very cost-competitive market, and you are focused squarely on cost minimization. So you set up your project portfolio, and it really is emphasizing all of your investments in reducing cost at the expense of product development and customer acquisition. So one day you wake up, right, and you are the most efficient producer of unwanted goods, and you've missed your window of innovation. And, in a way, you can think of it as you're sacrificing the forest for the preservation of a single tree. And the benefits driver test really gives us an indication of, are you taking a balanced view of how you create value in the organization? Now, the way we do that, it's actually pretty simple. We open up project charters and business cases, and we map those benefits into a basic value diagram that allows us to understand which of your initiatives are impacting revenue maximization, cost minimization, brand, retail, et cetera. And that begins to unlock whether you're taking a balanced view or not, and whether we have potential conflicts. The second method that we wanted to add to your toolkit is really around minimal viable product. And really what we use this for is to understand how much space we have to reduce scope across a number of initiatives. And if we're all familiar with an MVP test at the project level, it's where we get into trouble and we try to figure out what scope can we throw overboard and still be successful. At the portfolio level, we begin trying to analyze, okay, across 10 initiatives, where do we have the most room to cut back scope if we get that 11th project that we need to support, or we get in trouble with project number 3 or project number 4. And it's highly effective at really trying to figure out where the bloat is. And, from a stakeholder alignment perspective, who do we need to get on board if we need to make cuts in certain areas?
Right. And certainly the bloat also starts to beg some questions around alignment in terms of how much is, the Christmas tree effect of lopping things onto projects, forcing that scenario.
I love that. I mean, it's, I think about like when my kids were little, right? And, underneath the Christmas tree, there would be so many presents it would consume the entire living room as all of your relatives, sent you gifts and whatnot. And it really became the point of being overwhelming, actually, for your kids who, were like, where do I begin on this?
Definitely. That kind of takes us into another kind of alignment checkpoint around stakeholders. So we've all probably, certainly seen the org charts that you might put into a governance model. But the stakeholder heat map task is really an exercise where you attempt to look at the social network of players involved in the initiative, portfolio, or program, and compare it to the governance of the program itself. Whose point of view is missing? Are the key players all seeing eye to eye on the why you're doing this in the first place? Are the right players engaging regularly? I'll give an example from my own work. One of my clients was doing a major financial system upgrade, an ERP implementation, and I was brought in later on to help them clean things up. But what had happened early on was would have been smoked out by the stakeholder heat map test because certain key operating units and geographies simply were not being engaged and brought along throughout, and when key design decisions and process decisions were being made. And as a result, when they went to go live, there was an extreme amount of operational impacts that really had a bottom line impact to this organization. And it's simply, if you do the diagnostic up front, you could have seen that those folks weren't engaged or involved at the time.
Greg, I think the beauty of looking at your portfolio through the eyes of a stakeholder heat map is it's that basic point of you can't drive change unless the right people are on board. So if your sponsorship is not strong and you don't have the right stakeholders behind those initiatives, you're not going to be well positioned to deliver. And I think about that conversation with John after a couple glasses of wine, not that I drink too much, but when dessert arrived, it really became apparent as we were looking at John's steerco or steering committee and talking about it. There was kind of this quid pro quo at the senior leadership team level, and it kind of worked like this. Like, if you propose a project I am not, as your peer, going to tell you no, because if I tell you no, you're going to do the same thing to me. So, there was no resistance to saying no in this organization, and the worst part about it was, other than the person proposing the project, the rest of the people in the room weren't really behind it. So you can imagine if you're in John's team, you're going to have a lot of uphill work to try to get people on board. And that's what I think that stakeholder heat map lens really helps unpack that.
Absolutely. Kind of a related test, but more now thinking a little more externally, is the customer voice test. When you starting from looking at that governance structure that we had looked at and the stakeholder heat map, you need to do an examination to identify, where the customer's voice is represented within the governance structure of the program, and making sure that it's there in an adequate amount. Is the proxy for the customer's voice adequate based on the impact it will have on your customer? How should plans be adjusted to limit the impacts from a risk point of view with your customers? Again, another example from my own work, a client had gone through and was making a big operational adjustment. They had done a lot of work internally and included maybe systems and finance folks, but when it got to operations and they went to go live with that new order-to-cash process that they were following, they found huge customer and operational impacts to the point that the whole project initiative had to get canned after quite a large investment. That kind of story could have been done a little bit better had they simply been thinking through this customer and voice perspective early on.
I think about the basic question of, does your customer care about what you are taking on as an organization? That question is extremely important, not only to deal with the negotiation and infighting on what projects get funded and which ones don't, but think about it from a delivery perspective. Those team members that are doing the work, whether it's standing up a shared services organization or putting in an IT system, they need to be able to relate on why their work matters. Like, why does the customer care? And if we can't answer that, that really begs the question of, do we know what we're doing? And should we be doing this? So we've tried to introduce some additional methods on figuring out, do you have a problem? It starts with the math, right? It's the known methods that we've all developed around looking at resource capacity versus the number of projects you're taking on. But then there's these other lenses to look at. Benefits. Are you set up to deliver the benefits that you expected in a way that can help your organization grow? Stakeholders. Are the right people behind those initiatives, or are they not? Even, does the customer care? And is the answer to that question translated for the people on the team? All of those things will show up as project delivery problems if they're not addressed on the front end. Now we turn to that fundamental question of, what are you going to do about it? So, as a leader, you kind of begin looking at what your organization is taking on, and wow, your plate is probably just as full as that picture that we showed on the front end. So now what are you going to do? And with that, like some of the practices we just went through, we wanted to start with the known. Those concepts and methods that most of us on this call use, because it starts there. And then, Greg and I wanted to add to your toolkit 3 or 4 additional concepts for you to think about that really are, they're aimed at combating alignment issues and taking on too much. So let's start with, how do we do this today? Well, probably most of us on this call have used scoring frameworks, ways to prioritize the list of projects our organization is taking on, ranking them according to value and cost and impact. And they're highly effective on trying to figure out where to draw that line on what's most important. Many of us probably have also used some form of chunking and bundling to take the large program and break it into little chunks, or to take two interdependent projects and bring them together so that you can get some resource efficiencies. And lastly, I think everyone has used RACI charts at some level in the past to really figure out who's on point for what. And as a math guy, you can get super excited because you can sit in your office and you can figure out, okay, here are all the levers we need to pull to get supply and demand to match. And voila, everything is going to be perfect now, and we're going to deliver. And you rush out of your office, and then you hit the floor of the project, and all hell breaks loose because the math doesn't work. We're dealing with human beings that have to work together to drive at certain goals. So the answer doesn't happen in the lab. It happens on the field.
Absolutely, Brian. So, we're going to start out with some of the techniques that really address underlying alignment issues. And we're going to start with mastering the political dynamic. Solving for the alignment starts with here. The first thing for me is exposing that political dynamic. Power doesn't flow from the org chart. It's critical to understand how leadership makes decisions, who influences whom, what the official policy is versus what really goes down. I can't count the number of times that for me, figuring out who the influencers are and the people who really will tell you what's happening has made a difference in how I execute. On a more tactical front, we talked before on the science slide around RACI diagrams. I've used RACI diagrams simply to force the conversation about who's really accountable, responsible, consulted, and informed. Right? It's not just filling it out, but actually using that as a voice or a mechanism to force people to have a conversation around how things are going to work and surface those in order to avoid waste and frustration. But when Brian and I were prepping for this, Brian had a story about his little black book, and I'm going to put him on the spot and ask him to kind of share that one with us because it was just too good one to avoid.
It's funny. Thank you, Greg, for doing that to me. But I have used and continue to use a little black book to kind of record my notes on the political dynamic of various clients. And, the reason I do it is the more I observe, listen, and understand, the more impactful I can become in really trying to help negotiate how to get these things done in organizations and what are some of those major trade-offs. So if you see me with my little black book, you'll know what I'm up to. And, to be honest, there might be one or two of you on this call that has an entry in the little black book, and don't worry about it. It just is my notes on how I can best work with you to position change.
As kind of a transition there, in terms of that little black book, I'm sure Brian, as he was building the entries there, was creating a bond. But when we're talking here about creating a bond, we don't just mean that bonding like that way, but also bonding the goals of your portfolio, program, or initiative to the leader's goals. Sort of like these folks here are all chained together, getting that team impact and connecting those goals together make a big difference. I'm going to tell you a little story about some time I saw that not working very well. I was working doing an organizational assessment for a market research firm, a really big leader in the markets that they serve, and they're going through a big transformational change, a big bet initiative to revamp how they serve their customers. We were struck, myself and the rest of the evaluation team, around an underlying misalignment between the various operational technology and product development teams and their individual goals and the goal of this big initiative that was going on, and how we could see that was going to eventually cause some big trouble a little bit further down the road. When you do it right, and something I hope that I do in my own delivery, I take a number of really low-level tactics in here, from the most basic of looking at the company's strategy and the words they use to talk about themselves and trying to tie the initiative to that and show how it relates, to the more tactical, looking at how each initiative or in a program might relate to the long-term operational goals of a particular area to help build that alignment quite literally at the lowest possible level to make sure that we get the desired outcome.
Building alignment it's hard leadership work. And, think for a minute, If you think about probably the number one question I get from executives, what do you think that question is? Well, I'll tell you, it's usually how much time should I spend on this project? And it's actually the wrong question. It's not a question of volume of how much time, it's where you spend the time. And to create a leadership bond, the way I answer it for an executive is, in whatever time you spend on this project, 2/3 to 3/4 of your time has to be focused on creating that bond. It is on your shoulders to articulate what are we trying to achieve and what's your vision. It's also on your shoulders to listen and understand what the individual needs. What is their agenda? What are their development goals? And then lastly, to be able to coach and mentor and show that individual, whether they're a leader on your team or whether they're a team member, how their contribution matters both to them and to the corporate goals. So very, very hard work.
Yeah, it is. And then one of the things that we find as well is when the initiative is really long running, the need to sustain that over time is all the more important. So kind of transitioning from the tactics that we've talked about that are more aimed at the solely at the alignment piece to something that sort of straddles between alignment and doing too much is this concept of blueprinting. You know, I'm sure we've all done or seen blueprints over time that, you know, basically how do all the pieces fit together and, you know, how big do each of these things feel and are, you know, we have too many big things that we signed up for. You know, that's one of the outcomes of blueprinting on a very tactical level. I've used blueprinting and the gaps or spaces, the open questions, you know, visually as a means to help to drive alignment and help to kind of encourage folks, essentially gamifying filling in those blanks, you know, turn those squares yellow now until they make their decisions and, you know, try to incent everyone to make the decisions required around how things will work out so we can turn all those squares blue. You know, it can be a pretty good visceral reminder to folks of where we're going next. I'm sure, Brian, you've got some stories around blueprinting and how that's delivered some value.
I recall a healthcare client that they wanted to open up a new facility, and when they first reached out to us, it was a facility project. It was create the facility, move the equipment, move the bodies, open the new facility, it's all good. Just, you know, as we began to kind of unravel the blueprint, it became much more, right? It is a market strategy project. I'm moving into a new geography. How do I position myself with other healthcare providers in that space? It is a customer acquisition project. How do I acquire new customers into that healthcare facility and fill beds? It is a physician project, right, of how do I begin to bring physicians over and get them ready to operate in that new facility? And all of a sudden the lens changes. Instead of it being a facility project, it is really a business transformation that is being driven through a facility change. And I think that's the beauty of blueprinting is they're not project number 42 of 143 on a spreadsheet. Now all of a sudden we understand what is the breadth and depth of each of those projects, so we know what is it going to take.
Exactly.
There are two more concepts that we want to arm and equip you with. Like Greg said, we spent the last several minutes talking about how do you attack alignment issues, and we began the transition over of how do you attack capacity issues when you just have too much stuff on your plate. At a very simple, soft level, there's this concept of putting your portfolio on a diet. You know, if you think about, we draw this line between what we can fund and what we can't fund. Well, imagine if we could draw that line higher so that there are fewer projects funded and more that are not funded to create excess capacity. Now, I've been working my way through this over the past 10 years on how best to do this, and I've stumbled along the way, honestly. In the beginning, I would pad projects with 10 or 15% contingency. I might change productivity assumptions, all trying to get a little bit of space. And invariably, the budget officer or the procurement officer, they would see through my disguise, and they would see like the projects were padded, and it would get yanked out, and we would still get put in a position where we couldn't deliver on those things. So I'll tell you about how I've been attacking it recently, and maybe some of this stuff will land with you. The first thing I go after is strategic alignment. Let's make sure there's a clear tie between the strategic goals and the projects that we deem important. And if that clear tie isn't there, that project is probably going below the line. The next thing I'll go after is sponsorship. If you have a project in this portfolio, you better all be in. Because if you're not all in, I'm really not interested in carrying forward that project because I know there's going to be delivery issues. So either you're 100% in as a sponsor or you're not. And if you're not, it's probably going to go below the line. The next thing that I will really strive for or attack, if you want to think of it that way, is let's look at what's going on in the business environment around the organization, and let's play kind of worst-case scenario. So really unpack what is truly critical. I remember that we just had an internal annual planning retreat for Point B not too long ago, and I remember we went through this process of what are the most important things that we need to do, and there were 4 of them. And then I challenged the group to say, like, okay, if we had to get it to 1, how would we get it to 1? If our business was, facing significant hurdles and we had to get it to 1, what's the one thing that we needed to do? And it was very difficult because the value trade-offs were significant. But by doing that, we actually were able to help draw a higher line and really isolate what that number 1 thing is. And that's going to come back to help us when we have delivery issues, because if we can do that and sustain that, that creates excess capacity that we can use later on. The last we are all wired. As leaders, we're wired to please. We want to make a contribution. So we're starting with yes as the answer to any question about do we take this on or not. Well, imagine a world where you actually celebrated no as an answer to really drive focus on what absolutely do you need to take on and how do you keep the distractions away. And I have to admit, I'm a yes person, and I had to learn this the hard way. One of my executive sponsors several years ago taught me this well. I was leading a very large initiative, and we were bleeding scope through all channels, up, down, sideways. And it got so bad that the executive sponsor got swapped out. And the new executive sponsor, her name was Eva. Eva came in with a very simple mindset. She was a collective bargaining negotiator, and she rocked. The first thing she did was she got everybody anchored on, here's my philosophy. It's all about our non-negotiables. Here are non-negotiables. We must stand tall on that. Here's how you actually listen to what the business needs. And here's how you basically negotiate resolution on those things that are in dispute. The next thing she did was she sent us off to say, you guys as leaders, you guys need to be saying no. And each week she would review with us, what things did we say no to over the course of the past week? And 9 times out of 10, she celebrated the decisions that we made. Then she spent a lot of time with our team, really talking about, here's what we're doing and here's what we're not doing. And the main reason she did that was to really get that alignment within the project team that it was okay to say no to other distractions coming in as long as we hold true to those non-negotiables. And my favorite part of the whole story is once a week we'd bring 100-plus project team members together, and she had this magic wand that she would give out. And she would give it out to the one person who really made distractions disappear. And I thought it was a beautiful way to celebrate this. And I know some of you guys are thinking to yourselves, this is nonsense. It can't work. It actually can work, because what ends up happening is deeper in the project teams, people really get a sense of attaching themselves to those non-negotiables and fighting away those distractions. And all of a sudden, the churn that you have in looking at scope change disappears, and you now have more capacity.
Yeah, Brian, that's really an amazing story, and it's actually the most crucial part of everything we've gone through, right? If you think about the first couple of techniques we were talking about alignment, once you got that alignment built and you go through the diet exercise of figuring out how to trim, making it culturally okay to do the trimming is the thing that gets you back on track for success. So just an amazing kind of point, and not should be trivialized.
So remember Eva on that.
Yeah.
Anyways, to wrap up, there are a couple points I want to make before we open up to Q&A. One is, what have we tried to do in the past 15 minutes? It's arm and equip you with some different ways to drive alignment and to help you with capacity issues, ranging from working the political dynamic to blueprinting the big ideas so that you really understand the full magnitude of what you're taking on, all the way through, creating a mindset where you can really focus on what's most mission critical and separate that out from what's important. And I'll conclude by this. Going back to our food analogy, we should all be looking for balance and, really trying to focus in on what initiatives are really going to drive organizational performance, and to make sure we're putting our resources there, and we're putting our time and focus there, and we're staying away from those things that they might look tasty on the surface, but they do nothing in terms of driving the organization forward. So I want to thank you guys for listening to our perspective on how you combat taking on too much and how do you drive alignment to set yourself up for great delivery. I want to pause now and see what questions you guys have. So we have one question on, do you have any tips for when you didn't use these tools and are now in a pickle? How do you de-scope and deprioritize when your portfolio is not aligned? In some respects, when you have that kind of catastrophic moment where you're not set up for success, you need to, from my own experience, you need to create a little bit of drama to really stop the trains from moving, and then actually use some of the methods that we talked about to really shine a light on, are we taking on the most important things? Getting out of some of the things that are in motion is definitely an art, but in a way you intentionally want to try to stop the train to really get people to understand where are we at and what should we do.
Yeah, that's surfacing, whether it's surfacing the political dynamic, which is certainly something, some of the tools and tips we'd have, but even just surfacing exactly where your capacity problems are and starting to figure out where alignment needs to be. A lot of the recipes that we've offered, I think, work because they are, frankly, our approaches when you come in and things are out of whack. It may not feel great, but having to go back and handle those things is probably the only way forward.
Another question that was asked is, what do you do if you're not the leader in an organization that has a voice, and how do you impact change from deeper in the organization? And Greg, I really think your answers around mastering the political dynamic and stakeholder map really ring true.
Oh, definitely. In my own experience, sometimes you're going to be put in a situation, especially, for instance, for us as Point B, when we're coming into a new client, sometimes we might get brought in on a relatively low part of the totem pole because that's where the client has an urgent need. and figuring out how decisions get made and where those influencers and decision makers are, and then working to get in front of them in a way that's relevant, that creating a bond is certainly the approach that it would take to service and help you resolve those pieces.
Another question came in. For those of us who are executing, how do we get those who are feeding the pipeline more work? And I guess my interpretation of the question is it really gets into maybe how do you get people who are generating initiatives actually embedded in delivering the work so that they get closer to what's needed.
Well, I think you raised this point again, if we're understanding the question the correct way, which is setting a high bar for what it means to be a sponsor. I mean, essentially, that's what you were talking about in terms of the putting the portfolio on a diet. It's important that you have skin in the game and that you're providing that energy, not necessarily time, as you pointed out, but there is an energy that needs to be addressed first.
Yeah, well, I think I always think of there's no free lunch or free pass, right? If you're a sponsor, we're working you. And, as a leader in an organization, like if you're the project leader or program leader or PMO director, you have to create work for the sponsor, right? Like the sponsor is an integral part of making the whole thing work. And that's going to get that person closer to the work and really understand the dynamic.
So one person asked, if you have all these issues, what do you tackle number one? And again, I think we kind of did them in order, frankly, in the presentation. Whether you're talking about the first diagnostic test, which really, if we go back to the "do you have a problem" portion, actually being able to quantify the problem in terms of resource or capacity overhangs and dependency chains. Like you have to do the math, frankly, and then the other tests provide additional context of why it's not working, and then the solve. Again, we sort of did that in order. The solve starts with building alignment in terms of the bond and master and political environment, and then the diet. So I think we try to do it in order.
Well, I think, it all starts with alignment around the strategic outcomes. I think if you don't have that, that's kind of where you start, to your point, Greg. I love this question from Heather. Can you share examples of how you use blueprinting at key points as the program evolves in order to cultivate alignment when influencers quietly move on? And that's so true, right? I think that's very well said. It's amazing at the beginning of a project how many people are in your court, and then when things get tough in development and testing and implementation, they seem to disappear.
Sure.
But I do think, if you can think about the stage gates of a project, the more that is known, as you go deeper into the project, the more you want to refresh that blueprint to keep everybody focused on, are all of the parts of the project going to add the value we expect? And it also sets you up to refresh your benefit expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't emphasize this one enough, is that some of these exercises, whether it's a risk assessment exercise you do at the beginning or a blueprint, those things are not static, and they're not like put it on the shelf, you're done. They are things that you keep out continually. I know for myself, so running a really large complex program, I would, those slides are part of the standard content for steering committee. The big old blueprint or roadmap with a star, you are here, making sure that we all still agree that the stuff in front is still going and that the stuff in the back was done. So part of it is about discipline, the art of applying the science continually.
I think, Heather, the other way, I'm a little bit of a dinosaur, but if I'm running a major initiative, I will also create a massive printout of the blueprint and hang it in my steering committee room, because invariably an issue that we talk about at the steering committee level will take us there, right? And we can go back to what are we trying to do and what are all the pieces as a way to drive alignment on what does the thing look like at the end of the day. So think big plotter paper, whiteboard size.
So another person asked a question around, I think if I'm reading it correctly, why do we think this is any different? People have been juggling priorities for a long time. Certainly there are some basic, as we pointed out, some basic things that are maybe generating a little worse than usual in terms of the combination of the recession and big regulatory changes like the Affordable Care Act that are driving a bubble. We didn't talk about, there's also sort of an interesting trend that would be happening, which is that the PPM tools, these project portfolio management tools, and some advances there might actually be generating more visibility and making people think they can do more. It's sort of funny. They think you automate certain pieces, and so therefore I can actually somehow do 10 projects at once. So some of those things are happening. I guess maybe that's not completely answering the question, but I feel like those are probably a couple of factors that even we didn't go through in more detail.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And thank you all for some great questions. I'll leave you with a few closing comments. Number one, I think the thing that we really try to emphasize today is, project success is directly tied to stakeholder alignment and organizations that can really help optimize supply and demand. Or conversely, when those things don't occur, it sets projects up for a lot of challenges. The second thing I hope you walk away from is it's not a math exercise, right? Like, a lot of getting projects positioned for success have a lot to deal with who cares about them and who's going to really lean in and make it happen. And hopefully the methods that we laid out here today will give you some other lenses to look at how do you make those conditions apparent. And I hope the third thing that you walk away from is really being able to look at what you're taking on as an organization. Will it actually drive healthy growth of that organization? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, that probably means that there has to be an adjustment. Now, we appreciate you taking the time to participate with us today. We're glad that you could join us and hope the session was helpful. In the next day or two, we will email a link to the recorded presentation if there's anything you'd like to review or if you want to share it with your colleagues. And, please reach out to us directly if you have any questions. Like I said, Greg and I, we're on a mission, and our mission is simply to try to get you as leaders in the best position possible to deliver the most important projects for your organizations. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.